Close-up, a shaking hand, a silver pen, and the word finito written in cold fear. In the dim lights of Cielo, Arya crosses the line between life and death to warn a man who hasn't been seen in 30 years, igniting a cinematic bloodbath where the only thing more dangerous than the assassins is the forbidden connection between a savior and a killer.
Cielo Ristorante existed as a carefully orchestrated environment, a stage for the performance of tranquility. This was not the absence of noise, but the specific silence that wealth can purchase. Crystal against cloth was a sound with no sharp edges. Each movement was economical, performed by individuals who understood the currency of their own time. The soft Italian score created the illusion of a night without limits. For 3 months, she had integrated into this delicate system, learning its olfactory narrative. The overture of garlic, the 9 o'clock interlude of caramelizing sugar, and the final, exhausted exhalation of a kitchen that had been operating at peak capacity for 6 hours. Patrons were cataloged in her memory according to their financial acknowledgments. She had learned that Table 4, a secluded corner booth, was perpetually occupied, its attendant consistently dismissed before 2000 hours. This night, a new figure at Table 4 disrupted the chamber's unseen balance. His presence was not defined by appearance or volume, but was felt as a palpable shift in the atmospheric pressure. The room, once a warm space, filled with the comfortable weight of its own importance, now seemed to revolve around a solitary male in a charcoal suit. His 3 companions were physically oriented toward him, a nonverbal exhibition of their allegiance. He consumed his meal with a measured pace, his face a study in neutrality as he absorbed the dialogue from his left. His expression was a void, lacking boredom, satisfaction, or the practiced mask of a public figure. It was a profound stillness. It spoke of a deeply held principle to offer no facial information for external analysis. The server, adhering to the established ritual, retrieved the water and moved across the floor. It was then that a conversation from a nearby window table reached her. The 2 men wearing ill-fitting suits conversed in a low, tense mix of English and another language. The server's mind captured the essential fragments. The car, the back way, after he leaves. A single word, however, activated a dormant, instinctual alarm. Finito. Her history, forged in a world of high stakes, had encoded this term with the meaning of imminent violence. A profound physiological response took over. Her gaze locked onto the man at Table 4. Her conviction was not a product of reason, but of a visceral certainty, likely triggered by the nervous glances of the other men and one's hand held in an unnaturally fixed position beneath the table, concealing an object. It is possible her age, 24, combined with a life spent interpreting the subtle signs of threat, shaped her reading of the situation. Observing the man's absolute composure, she understood he was entirely unaware of the lethal arrangement awaiting him outside. On her return from the water station, she folded a message written on a receipt from her apron. It consisted of 5 words: "Men at window, leave now." The handwriting was compromised by the tremor in her hand. A logical mind would have calculated the potential consequences. A logical mind would have considered Bastian, the man who assigned her this specific shift 3 weeks prior, whose quiet directive to notice things had been accompanied by a photograph of Table 4. A logical mind would have recalled her brother, Nico, and the probable response from Bastian's network should she neglect her implicit duty. Her path to Table 6 took her past Table 4. She deposited the note into the left pocket of his jacket, which was draped over the chair's back, her action concealed by the pretense of retrieving a fallen item. Her eyes remained lowered, a posture of deference intended to make her functionally invisible. After delivering the water to Table 6 and deliberately mismanaging an order, She registered the sound of chairs moving at table 4, not with haste, but with deliberation. It was the sound of an individual who has processed a threat and is already formulating the counter move. She did not permit herself to watch his exit. Her focus was anchored to her notepad, the pen digging into the paper. He paused at the doorway. She registered his gaze as a physical sensation. The door swung inward, admitting a sharp intrusion of cold night air before it sealed shut again. The two men at the window exchanged a glance. One of them then rose to his feet. The restaurant's established rhythm persisted, unbroken. The pianist continued his melody. A patron ordered the branzino. She departed at 2300 hours and sat in her kitchen, enclosed in a state of detached calm. A call from Nico remained unanswered. She actively constructed a reality where the event was concluded and her part in it was finished. The following morning, her front door revealed two men in the hallway who requested, with a measured politeness, that she accompany them. Her belief that her involvement was over was shown to be a catastrophic failure of imagination. Her apartment, a territory she had claimed over 8 months, suddenly became a curated exhibition of her life. 3 damaged mugs repurposed as plant pots, an unframed photo of her mother, a list on the refrigerator that began with rent and concluded with Nico, the final and most significant liability. She took mental inventory of these items from the interior of a black vehicle that smelled of leather and a colder, more abstract element. It was the specific chill of a man who has been waiting in darkness, and she struggled against a rising wave of nausea. The courtesy of the two men was a discordant and unsettling feature. Their conduct was devoid of any overt threat. One secured the elevator, the other stated, "Mr. Vitelli wishes to see you." The declaration was followed by a silence that implied a choice where no choice was present. Lorenzo Vitelli. In the 3 minutes between securing her apartment and entering the elevator, she initiated a search on her mobile device. The information was both immediate and deeply disturbing. The Chicago Tribune linked the Vitelli name to 3 decades of alleged organized criminal activity. A low-resolution telephoto image was insufficient for a positive identification, but was more than adequate to provide context for the world she had just entered. The vehicle came to a stop in front of a building on the north side, its design engineered to induce a sense of insignificance. It was constructed of pale stone and high windows, its primary doors opened by a doorman before their arrival. Inside, the marble floors registered their coolness through her shoes. The soaring ceilings, cream-colored walls, and a floral arrangement that likely exceeded her monthly rent all served to communicate a single, unambiguous message of power. The air carried the scents of candle wax, coffee, and the subtle, hard-to-define aroma of generational wealth. He was positioned at the far end of a long corridor. There was no ambiguity as to his identity. The dim lighting of the restaurant had veiled him, but she recognized his characteristic stillness at once. He stood with a deliberate precision, hands in his pockets, flawlessly centered in the space. It was the controlled posture of a predator in waiting. His eyes were fixed on her. "You could have been killed," he said, forgoing any introductory ritual. "I'm aware of that," she responded. The barest hint of tension receded from his features. "Sit." He indicated a tall-backed chair nearby. She complied with the command. He chose to remain standing, employing his physical elevation and the surrounding space as instruments of control. It was a practice, she would later grasp, of reshaping any environment to fit his own internal architecture. "You're at Cielo 3 months now," he said, a statement of fact, not a question. "Prior to that, a diner on Milwaukee Avenue, a catering company. You are a biology student at DePaul. You have a brother. You compiled a dossier on me overnight, she articulated. I compile a dossier on anyone who interferes with my affairs, he retorted. I saved your life. You brought a threat to my attention, he amended, the nuance being of immense importance to his worldview. Whether I would have neutralized it without your note is a separate analysis. You're welcome, she replied, an unwise display of defiance. He resumed his study of her with that same flat, unblinking concentration. It was not an absence of feeling, but a state of heightened data processing. It was the same quality of attention he would afford any subject that he deemed worthy of his complete focus. The men by the window, he stated, you have encountered one of them before. Her pause was its own confession. He demonstrated an ability to outlast any silence. I've seen him, she admitted. He entered the diner months ago with another man, asking questions about my brother. She drew a breath. I remained silent last night because I had no context for who you were. I gave you that note because I observed an ambush in progress, and my own moral code would not permit inaction. That is the full extent of it. A silence expanded between them. A second man materialized in the doorway, heavily built, in his mid-40s, his face a testament to past conflicts. He assessed her with an inscrutable expression before his attention moved to Lorenzo. A silent exchange occurred between them. Marco, Lorenzo said, his gaze unwavering from her. Make the East Room ready. Marco's eyes returned to her, his expression altering by a fractional degree. It was not yet amicable, but it was no longer entirely hostile. He started a detached analysis of the new variables. This alters the equation. Your brother, Lorenzo stated, what is their interest in him? She felt the cold of the marble floor, a sharp physical sensation that mirrored the psychic fracture occurring within her. Her identity as a biology student and server was disintegrating. This moment was redefining her entire being. Money, she replied. He has an outstanding debt. Lorenzo offered a single economical nod. He began walking down the corridor without another word, and she moved to follow. This act was an unconscious transference of trust, a gravitation toward the single individual who, in a paradox, now represented the only element of stability in this profoundly unstable situation. By the end of the second day, she had catalogued the house's acoustic identity, the groans of its structure and its mechanical exhalations, including a distinct quiet she could only describe as an atmosphere of waiting. Her assertion that she was not a prisoner was a poorly constructed defense of self-delusion, supported by the semblance of autonomy that a bathroom, a window, and a door lock could offer. Marco's delivery of coffee was a carefully staged act of social engineering, a measured attempt to build a connection. His statement, "He won't hurt you," was surgically targeted at the core of her anxiety, a clear indication that her emotional landscape was being systematically monitored and managed. No, she replied, a careful edit of the truth. Her focus was chained to her brother, Nico. Marco pronounced the name with the sterile detachment of a physician assessing a case file. We're handling it. He is unaware of my presence. He understands you're not in danger. A pause, more secure than the situation implies. She resisted probing further, detecting the unyielding quality of his tone. By her third day, a new map of the power structure started to form. Lorenzo's terse, severe interactions were not coldness, but a type of reverence, a chilling mental reset that signals the beginning of trauma bonding. This realization was not verbal. It was forged by observing the men's predatory poise, the way their gazes meticulously deconstructed the environment. All talk ceased upon Lorenzo's arrival, a stillness rooted not in fright, but in a total, practiced orbit around their gravitational core. In the kitchen on day 3, her intrusion caused Marco to hesitate, an opening she used to extract information. "Tell me about him." "No, I want to know about this operation. I'm past feigning ignorance." He assessed her, then yielded. "The Vitelli family has controlled Chicago for 30 years. Lorenzo assumed command 6 years ago." And then a vital detail emerged. "He is not a man who governs through intimidation." "That's the common misconception. Terror breeds unpredictability, not allegiance." He sipped his coffee. "Lorenzo commands through silence." "What took place 6 years prior?" The inquiry was surgical. Marco paused. "His sister." The name, the subsequent emptiness, the clench of his jaw, it was the complete narrative she required. A loss so vast it calcifies into something beyond sorrow. She recognized a faint reflection of her own mother's passing 4 years ago, how she'd built a new identity around that void, becoming what she termed the silhouette of what was lost. That afternoon, she overheard Lorenzo's voice from behind a door. The Italian was rapid and muted, but its tenor was a fissure in the cool persona she had constructed. It conveyed not indifference, but a contained pressure, like a high-tension cable vibrating under load. She proceeded up the staircase. On the landing, for some indefinable reason, she paused. The wall was a documented lineage, a collection of stark black and white portraits. A family. Set slightly away from the rest was a photograph of a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old. Her hair was dark, as she was captured mid-laugh, a frame excised from a moment of unadulterated happiness. The familial link to Lorenzo was simultaneously non-existent and undeniable. That night at dinner, a surreal ceremony with 10 unspeaking men. Marco took the seat next to her. His voice was a hushed confidence. "Caruso is encroaching on the north side." "Caruso?" She echoed the name. "Dante Caruso." He studied her expression. "Is he the one your brother is indebted to?" "Oh." Were those his men at the restaurant? He simply observed. The affluent, she mused, always have their lethal pastimes. She recalled the name of the agent who located her, Bastian. Marco's expression betrayed no shock, only the soft click of a hypothesis locking into place. "Bastian is on Caruso's payroll. What was your assignment at CeeLo?" "Table monitoring," she answered. "He instructed me to observe. He failed to mention." Her voice faded. "He never specified who the occupants would be. He only provided a picture of the table." "Not of Lorenzo?" "No." A profound quiet settled between them. Marco then spoke gently. "You were meant to report your findings to them, but you alerted Lorenzo instead." "Correct." "Why?" She fixed her gaze on her plate. The quality of the food, like all things here, was becoming unnervingly familiar. It was an illogical decision. She stated. After a beat, he extended a strange form of reassurance. Julia would have made the same choice. She had no need to ask who Julia was. The pieces were already connecting. That night, the sounds from her window shifted. A void in the background hum, the lack of a guard's footfalls on gravel. She flattened herself against the wall, adopting a defensive stance. In the morning, she learned that 2 of Caruso's men had probed their defenses. They failed to breach them. 3 of Lorenzo's men had tracked them for 4 blocks before discreetly neutralizing them. The menace was no longer a theoretical danger, it was now tangible. This was the 6th day. She had claimed a haven in a 2nd-story library, a space with a worn leather couch and a window overlooking the garden. She retreated there in the midday stillness. He discovered her, or maybe he just walked in, not knowing she had made the room her own. He froze in the entrance, his expression for an instant, that of a man finding his own home inexplicably altered. "Don't move," he said as she started to rise. It was less an order than a simple statement of fact. Taking a chair across the room, he opened a file and began to read with complete focus. She feigned interest in her own book, rereading the same line 4 times. The silence was substantial but not strained. It lacked the typical signs of tension. She, who usually rushed to fill quiet spaces with chatter, felt no compulsion to talk. After 20 minutes, his gaze still on the document, he remarked, "You're not eating sufficiently." "I'm eating just fine." "You hardly ate any dinner." She looked over. He was still absorbed in his reading. "You observed that?" He offered no reply. "I observed," she said, her tone level, "that you consume food more rapidly when you're analyzing information." He lifted his eyes from the file. "That degree of detailed scrutiny, do I?" "And you invariably choose the seat with an unobstructed view of the exit. And your men's attitudes shift depending on your sleep, indicating you operate on a constant deficit." She fell silent, having revealed too much. "My apologies. I see things. It's the ability you, or more accurately Bastian, retained me for." "I never retained you for anything," he stated. A flat correction devoid of anger. "True. Bastian did." The folder closed with a snap. He placed it on the chair's arm. "What was the precise figure Bastian quoted for your brother's debt?" She told him the amount, scanning his face for any hint of a reaction, but found none. "That isn't the original loan," Lorenzo said. "Caruso's rate is 250% monthly. The sum Nico borrowed 3 months back is now..." He abandoned the calculation, seeing its futility. "Where is he, Arya?" "A place on the west side. He knows to avoid it while I'm..." Her words faltered. "He knows to remain invisible." "Caruso's network already has his location," he said, the absence of feeling in his voice making it sound like a final judgment. "They've had it for 2 weeks. The only reason he's alive is because he's being used as collateral." "Against me," he clarified, "by leveraging you." A silence descended on the room, so profound I could now hear a mantel clock that had previously gone unnoticed. My brother's existence was a pawn in a war against him, a consequence of the warning I'd issued. His face showed no remorse, only a stark recognition of our shared culpability. He looked down at his own hands, which were perfectly composed. I noticed the pale scar there, a testament to the discipline of a man who had conquered every impulse. He rose, and as he approached the door, he intentionally passed through my personal space. His knuckles grazed the sofa's back as he went by, a brief, anchoring contact like someone steadying himself on a pitching deck. He did not make eye contact. Long after he departed, I focused on the spot his hand had touched. I tried to write it off as an accident, a man unaccustomed to sharing a space, but the excuse felt hollow and transparent. From Lorenzo's perspective, for 20 minutes he had observed her performance of a person reading a book. It was a posture of stillness he knew from interrogations, the manufactured calm of a subject trying to conceal their terror. She, in contrast, felt no terror. She felt clinical. The difference was absolute. When she recited her observations of him, it ignited a sensation he had never before experienced. He was accustomed to being watched for signs of weakness, not documented with the dispassionate curiosity one would give a piece of art. His hand at the sofa had been a bulwark, a physical restraint against the impulse to remain in that quiet, surprisingly tolerable room. He did not return. On the 9th day, Nico telephoned. Marco had provided a secure phone, which I understood to be monitored, not confidential. The device was still a foreign object in my palm when Nico's name appeared, and a cold band constricted around my chest. His voice was flat, the words recited from a screenplay he didn't write. "I need to know where you are. Nico, just be quiet and hear me." I had retreated to the claustrophobic bathroom, a grim routine that was now instinct. "I understand this pattern, the debt you owe, and who holds the note. Have you given them any information?" The line returned, only static. "Nico." "The address?" He finally confessed. "They demanded the address. I swore I had no idea, but they produced a picture, Arya, of you entering this building." His voice fractured. "They're tracking you. They have been for days." A frigid fear tightened in my gut. "Are you injured?" I pressed. "No. Right at this moment, are you in a secure location?" "Yes, A long beat of silence. "I believe someone is positioned outside my apartment building." "Do not go out." I squeezed my lids shut. "I am going to resolve this. Stay there. Do not step outside." I ended the call and stood in the silent bathroom for 30 seconds before I went to find Lorenzo. He was with Marco and 2 other men, all of them engrossed in a collection of maps and reconnaissance photos. My entrance captured everyone's attention but his. Lorenzo, speaking to the others, stated plainly, "Leave us." Their immediate silent compliance was a testament to his authority. "Caruso possesses a photograph of me at this location," she stated, her tone devoid of emotion. "My brother provided it. He was under pressure, ill-equipped to refuse them." Lorenzo's gaze remained fixed upon hers. "He is 21, she continued, her voice hardening to conceal a faint tremor. "He fails to grasp their nature. His upbringing was not mine. To him it was merely a loan." Lorenzo held his silence. "You have served as his bulwark for a great while." "He is my kin." "That is not what my eyes perceived," he countered, weighing his words. "I witnessed you shouldering his burdens." "The weight of his existence, the manner in which you bear it is not a recent development. It is a deeply ingrained pattern." She could only gaze back, stunned by such an incisive deconstruction of her most private reality. "He must be brought to this place," she insisted. "With him in such proximity, Caruso could leverage him to—" "I am thoroughly cognizant of Caruso's capabilities." He rose to his full height. "Marco is already en route. Nico will arrive in under an hour." His eyes met hers again. "You should have informed me of the call without delay." "It only just occurred." "I am aware." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Arya, the man at your Milwaukee residence months ago, the one who inquired about your brother." He waited. "Did he issue a direct threat against him?" The inquiry was not a request for new data. It was a demand for confirmation. "He stated that if I declined to cooperate, Nico would come to harming Van," she answered. "He framed it as a simple surveillance task. My arrival here was under duress." "You came because you had exhausted all other options." she corrected herself. And upon your arrival, you were simply... She hesitated. She had nearly articulated, just a person. You were present. Those men were scheming, and I could not be complicit. He observed her for a drawn-out moment, his look analytical, as if gathering variables for a future calculation. Then he was gone. She collapsed into his immense office chair, interlacing her fingers, her mind consumed by thoughts of her brother and the 26 months that had passed since their mother's death. She mentally retraced the sequence of choices that had led her to this chamber, awaiting the board's next dictate of her fate. To be clear, remaining was a conscious decision. The fire escape she had noted earlier was a fleeting consideration, quickly discarded. This was not a product of fear. It was because Nico was en route, and Lorenzo's observation, how you bear him, felt like the first time in years she had been truly perceived. She was at a loss as to how to process the sensation, but she knew she was not prepared to flee. Nico appeared pallid and drained, as if he had braced himself for a storm of rage she no longer possessed. With a dispassionate professionalism, Marco escorted him to a room adjacent to her own. That evening, their low-toned discussion permeated the wall for what seemed like hours. By dawn, Marco's disposition toward Nico had shifted. It was not kindness, but a sentiment that had transcended mere condemnation. 4 days later, Caruso executed his strategy. The assault began at 8 in the evening, the initial sound piercing the quiet as she ate. It was not the dramatic detonation one might anticipate from cinema. It was a singular, sharp report, then a second. An alarm sounded in its wake, its rhythm conveying not alarm, but a cold and methodical lethality. The lights in the east wing extinguished, supplanted by a profound crimson luminescence, as if the structure itself were hemorrhaging. Marco materialized in the doorway. "You're with me," he commanded. He guided Nico and her to a chamber deep within the building's core, secured by a door of reinforced steel. Leaving a guard, he instructed her, "Do not open this for any face you do not recognize." She gave a nod. He vanished. The 40 minutes that ensued were the most protracted of her existence. The noises arrived in staccato bursts, a profound silence punctuated by acts of violence that were more disquieting than sustained combat. They could hear indistinct struggles from within the walls, a crash from the level above. Nico, in a rare gesture, took her hand and remained silent, his unspoken grip more alarming than the turmoil outside. Then, a weighty, conclusive stillness fell. The door swung open. It was Lorenzo, but a transformed version. The poised man from the library had vanished. The control was present, but it now served as a cage for something feral. His jacket was gone, and a dark efflorescence of red on his shoulder drew her gaze, then made her avert it. His facial features were unaltered, but the stillness in his eyes had a different quality. It was no longer patience. It was something more elemental, contained under extraordinary pressure. His eyes located her first. "You are unharmed," he stated. It was a declaration, not an inquiry. "No." Her voice was a bare whisper. He glanced at Nico, an inscrutable emotion crossing his expression before it returned to her. "We must relocate you to the West Wing." "You are wounded," she observed. "That is an established reality." "Lorenzo," she stood. "You are bleeding. I have some emergency medical training. You must allow me to—" His tone was different, stripped of its customary authority. The way he perceived her had fundamentally changed. The same severe focus was there, yet a new current flowed beneath it. an energy that was absent from his prior composure. She would understand the reason later. 6 of Caruso's operatives had penetrated the north wall during a diversionary tactic at the main gate. 2 had managed to get inside. Lorenzo intercepted them on the 3rd floor. The injury on his shoulder was from a blade. He had evidently deemed it an inconvenience unworthy of his immediate attention. That night revealed to her that the serene, controlled man she had known for 2 weeks was a meticulously engineered facade. What it concealed was the mechanism of lethal, absolute, and immediate violence. The men under his command had operated with a faith in his judgment that was nearly devotional, and he had not betrayed that faith. She was uncertain if that was a reassuring realization. Later, in a West Wing parlor, she confronted him with a medical kit and a confidence she did not feel, cleansing the gash on his shoulder as he sat in utter silence. Not a single sound, not even as the antiseptic stung the wound. "This requires sutures," she informed him. "I am aware. I am not equipped to do that for you here." "I know." His gaze never left her face. It was not fixed on the injury, it was fixed on her. "You do not fear the sight of blood," he remarked. "I fear a great many things," Feinsart replied. "Blood is merely data." A moment passed. "I fear you," she conceded, the words escaping her before she could contain them. The movement of the cleaning pad ceased. His response was delayed. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had ever heard it. "I know." "Not," she began, then paused. "Not in the manner I initially believed." She kept her focus on the wound, incapable of meeting his eyes to speak the words. "I believe my fear was of what you represent, of this world, of the things that transpire within it." The pad began to move once more. Steady. "That is no longer what terrifies me." "Then what does?" She pressed the gauze into place. His shoulder was hot beneath her palm. She did not withdraw her hand quickly enough. "Myself," she said, "when I am in your presence." The subsequent silence was a tangible entity within the room. He placed his hand over hers. It was not a grasp or a form of restraint. It was a simple placement, his palm covering the back of her hand where it rested on the bandage, on his own flesh. It felt like an action that had been considered for a very long time. She did not stir. Outside, his men were eradicating the evidence from the north perimeter as the city continued its oblivious hum. But in that room, the heat of his hand fused hers to him, and for a long interval, neither of them spoke. When he finally drew away, the motion was gradual, hesitant. "The engagement is over," Marco announced from the doorway. She had no sense of how long he had been observing, his expression one she still could not decipher. Lorenzo looked at Marco. "I know," he said. Following that moment, everything changed. The very cadence of the household altered. More men materialized. Guard shifts were shortened. Discussions would cease upon her entry into a room, only to resume the instant she departed. Lorenzo was both omnipresent and absent, a spectral figure who moved through the residence. His presence felt long after he had left. He found her in the library one night. They hardly communicated, but the quiet between them was now different. It was a familiar pressure, imbued with a new significance. Nico became agitated. His perpetual anxiety sharpened to a razor's edge. Guilt rendered him unable to meet her gaze, his apologies for minor things becoming too frequent. Through the wall, Marco's voice had been a low drone during 2 extended sessions with him. Nico would emerge from them looking hollow, bearing the tormented look of a man made to confront his own reflection. I should have informed you about Bastion earlier, he admitted on the third morning. Yes, she confirmed. I believed I could manage it. I know you did. She observed her brother, a boy of 21, so reckless with a life she was conditioned to safeguard. You will assist them, Nico, with whatever they require. This is a liability that transcends money. He nodded, appearing diminished. That afternoon, Marco transported them to what Lorenzo termed a secondary location. It was another structure, devoid of any aesthetic, engineered for pure function. It was situated on the periphery of a derelict grid of warehouses and residences. The journey took 30 minutes. Marco conversed in Italian on his phone from the front seat as she watched the city stream past the window, a relic of a life she had since abandoned. An hour following their arrival, the assault commenced. She never witnessed it. She only perceived its savage orchestration. 2 sharp reports from the front, succeeded by a cacophony of shouts, the building's alarm, a deeper, more insistent pulse than the house's. Then followed a singular sound that would etch itself as a scar upon her memory. A sound that was not loud, but was imbued with the gravity of a final, disastrous failure. One of them hastened them toward a rear room, his eyes fixed on the floor. His hands betrayed him, clenched into fists so rigid they signaled a frantic struggle for self-control. Marco, she whispered. He's stable, the man said, but a quaver in his tone rendered it a falsehood. Marco was not stable. A bullet had struck him as he was getting Nico to safety. It was a precise wound, intended to incapacitate, betraying their enemy's intimate knowledge. He was alive, and he would remain so. But for 2 hours, she sat with her back to the wall outside that room and waited. The cost of her new existence became brutally clear. He was under their watch. Proximity to Lorenzo, being his choice, extracted a price, paid by those she grew to value. Beside her, Nico remained enveloped in silence. 40 minutes passed before Lorenzo's tempestuous arrival. He advanced down the hall, his gaze raking over the exterior guards. 3 clipped Italian words from him made the men recoil. His eyes then found hers. He bypassed pleasantries, recognizing her state and offering no hollow solace. Our route was compromised, he stated tonelessly. The betrayal originated internally. Her eyes snapped to Nico, who stared intently at the ground. Nico, she uttered, her voice a ghost from a former life. Did you disclose our destination? His quiet was a confession. A call came this morning, he admitted to the floor. They threatened. The name Arya caught in his throat. Forgive me, I never imagined they would. A sharp, arresting motion from Lorenzo silenced him. The older man scrutinized Nico with an inscrutable, chilling expression before turning to her. In his gaze was a quiet apology, the only one she would get and the only one required. He is my brother, she stated, presenting a simple, undeniable fact. I am aware, Lorenzo replied, turning from her as his operational world enveloped him. She stayed with Nico, grasping his quaking hand, contemplating the paradox of simultaneous love and rage. By evening, they were separated by Lorenzo's unilateral decree. Her permission was irrelevant. A note slipped beneath her door that night, read, "He is secure. He comprehends. An opportunity to regain his standing will be provided." The script was Marco's, proof he could wield a pen again. She clutched the paper in a dark room within a city that now felt like hostile territory. Caruso's operatives seized her on a Tuesday, the day she resumed marking time. The capture was brutally efficient, needing no elaborate design. Though the location was secure, it was penetrable by Caruso's extensive network. She was, as he would later remark, the simple key to a complex lock. 2 men, 1 rear exit, 1 vehicle. 40 minutes later, she was inside another unknown building. Her cell was Spartan, 1 high window and a chair secured to the ground. The following hours were defined by a deep, vacant silence, not by overt drama. The man who appeared, Dante Caruso, was not the figure of her imagination. His calm articulation mirrored Lorenzo's stillness, but where Lorenzo's suggested coiled strength, Caruso's projected a chilling absence. It was as if a vital part of him had been surgically excised, leaving a sterile void. He began weaving narratives about Lorenzo. Some were crafted to instill terror, others to seed doubt. The most potent were those threaded with indisputable fact. "He will not trade for you," Caruso stated with clinical detachment. "You must accept this. Men of Lorenzo's caliber do not negotiate. They retaliate." "Then he will retaliate," she replied. A flicker of what seemed like respect showed in Caruso's eyes. "You feel no fear." "I feel it," she corrected him, "but I will not allow you to weaponize it. Your actions cannot alter my own." Her stare was unwavering. "I would do it again." He inclined his head. Warn him, even knowing this? "Yes." He paused, studying her. "For what reason?" She offered no explanation, not from a lack of one, but because her motive was a territory he could not conquer. They abandoned her to the cold quiet. She sat on the floor, an act of defiance against the provided chair. With her back against the wall, her thoughts drifted to a forbidden place. Lorenzo's hand over hers, the warmth through the bandage, the library's light, Marco's note, and an image of a laughing woman. Her psyche did not shatter. This was a clinical assessment, born not of resilience, but of the fact that no whole part remained to be broken. She was already a composite of mended fragments. Beyond her room, Lorenzo was not executing a strategy. He was enacting something more primal than a plan. Every asset, every operative, 30 years of accrued intelligence, all converged on her position. From a hospital bed, Marco coordinated the flow of information, and Nico, the betrayer, was with them, afforded a single chance to redeem his transgression. In the second hour, the true source of the leak was identified, one predating Nico. An older subordinate named Ferrara, once loyal to Lorenzo's father, had been funneling intelligence to Caruso for 11 months. It was a ruinous deception. The toll of this discovery on Lorenzo was something she would only grasp much later. Her door was breached in the 6th hour. Lorenzo was not the first to enter. 2 unknown men stormed in, followed by a third she knew, a household guard with a grim face. Then Lorenzo appeared. The room's 6-hour silence erupted into chaos. He moved directly to her, his focus absolute. "Are you injured?" he demanded, his voice a raw, strained thing she had never heard, stripped of its usual control. "No," she said. His eyes performed their own frantic damage assessment, trusting only his sight. He grasped her shoulders, not gently, but with the grounding force of a man who had just waged a war to reach her. It was the grip of someone who had secured their objective. She pressed her face to his chest, felt the frantic, irregular rhythm of his heart, and understood his terror. For 6 hours, fear had fractured the formidable man's iron discipline. A profound quiet lay between them. "Caruso," she murmured into his chest. His position is known, Lorenzo stated grimly. Then you must go, she replied. He drew back, meeting her gaze in a moment stripped of all artifice. Let the record show she was no helpless captive. Upon being sealed in, she had spent 20 minutes analyzing her confinement. The window's real glass was a high, mocking fixture. The door, a solid barrier. The chair, bolted down, offered a slim hope. Its seat was attached with 4 screws. A faint seam along the baseboard in far corners suggested a structural vulnerability, a product of time and neglect. She did not escape. No such triumph is claimed. Yet by the second hour, a plan had taken shape, and she stood poised by the wall. When the door was finally breached, she was not passively waiting. She was at the entry, causing the first man to falter and the second to be thrown off balance. Lorenzo, entering third, walked not into a rescue, but into a scene of kinetic violence. His eyes absorbed it all with silent comprehension, adding this new data to his evolving profile of her. Caruso's stronghold was 3 miles distant. Lorenzo departed for it, as she was transported back to the main residence, which she preferred. She understood her function was not on a battlefield. To be a liability in such a high-stakes operation was unthinkable. Nico rode with her. He sat opposite, his gaze fixed on the passing city, and she observed him for some time before speaking. You were involved in the search. I refused to remain idle while... I know, she interjected. He finally met her eyes. Her brother, 21, operating from a place of pure fear. History's most common catalyst for poor judgment. Can you ever forgive me? It is already done, she said. But forgiveness does not erase the event. I understand. The vehicle moved through the Chicago streets, which appeared cruelly unchanged. This was the disorienting nature of her recent life. The mundane world continued its spin. People dined out, walked pets, argued over parking. Her world now operated under its own violent climate, the two realities coexisting. She had crossed an unmarked border from one to the other. At 3 a.m, Lorenzo returned. She heard the main door waiting in the library, sleep being an impossible luxury. She heard his steps in the hall, expecting them to ascend the stairs. Instead, they paused outside the library before the door swung open. He simply occupied the doorway, appearing as a man who had traversed hell and was now assessing his own remnants. His features were unchanged, but some deep internal structure had been irrevocably shifted, the very framework of his being reconfigured. She asked, "Is it concluded?" Caruso is no longer a threat, he said, and his organization, he paused. They will be forced into new allegiances, it is. Shattered, he corrected himself. Confirmation will require time, but it is shattered. He entered the room, taking the sofa across from her, the closest he had ever positioned himself, and leaned forward, studying his hands. Ferrara, he said after a moment. Marco informed me, she replied. During my... She trailed off. You had faith in him for a very long time. Since I was 20, he confirmed. He served my father. She refrained from offering platitudes. Instead, she observed, that form of treachery inflicts a unique kind of damage. Yes. A silence settled. What was the cost? She asked. Tonight, he looked up. Explain? I was trying to analyze his pathology. Caruso was more than an adversary. He was a contagion. I reminded him of his own words to Marco, that he embodied the final corruption of their world, a force of pure entropy. I met his stare. To defeat that, you had to inhabit that same internal wasteland, didn't you? Silence stretched between us. I did. A choice you made consciously? Yes. For me. His gaze, usually a fortress, became an open wound. That was not the sole consideration. I acknowledged this truth. His other reasons were the pillars of his identity, his dominion, his soldiers, his legacy. Yet I felt with an unshakable conviction my own thread running through the very weave of it all. It's possible only one of us will emerge from this. I voiced the specter that haunted me. Who? He countered. I studied him, the architect of a magnificent brutal empire sustained by sheer volition, a man whose grief for his sister had calcified his heart against fracture, who, compelled by a waitress's note, had returned relentlessly. Neither of us, I concluded. I believe this is unsurvivable for us both. He regarded me, then whispered almost inaudibly, "No, stay." The endgame with Caruso was no surgical strike. The details came from Marco, impossibly recovered a week later, who understood my psyche required the sterile truth of the account. Caruso had anticipated their arrival. His decision to remain, Marco explained, was not hubris, but the deliberate staging of a final, violent tableau. He and Lorenzo exchanged a last colloquy, a grim sacrament for two men whose parallel journeys of brutality had converged on this terminal point. Caruso's parting statement, per Marco, was a venomous reflection. We are the same man. Your narrative is merely more palatable. Following a profound silence, Lorenzo's response was a concession that sealed his fate. I know. This moral capitulation was total, even as the physical conclusion devolved into chaos. Two of Caruso's enforcers were eliminated. One of Lorenzo's was left clinging to life. Regarding Caruso, Marco was deliberately oblique, stating he was no longer a factor. The truly significant data point, he emphasized, was Lorenzo's profound transformation. He returned not shattered, but remade, as one is after traversing a moral Rubicon and electing to inhabit the bleak territory beyond. His discipline was ever present, Marco observed. The motivation behind it has changed. A silent volume was communicated in his gaze before the professional facade returned. He clarified. That control is now tethered to you. It is not performance nor a strategy of disarmament. Each action is now meticulously calibrated under the weight of your constant observation. An unsustainable psychic load, I noted. Correct, Marco conceded. And simultaneously the most humanizing influence on him in the last 6 years. The subsequent week was a whirlwind of repercussions I perceived only peripherally. A flurry of strategic consolidations and emergent pacts indicated a brutal restructuring of his dominion. Though barred from the tactical sessions, my existence was a subtle anchor, pulling Lorenzo nightly to the library where I'd become a permanent feature. The last spasm of violence was born from a miscalculation, a zealot named Voss, loyal not to Caruso's wealth but his creed, a far more volatile devotion. Voss launched his assault with 4 operatives on a Thursday afternoon, exploiting a period of reduced security. The perimeter was compromised by 2 of them. I was in a corridor as alarms blared. My impulse was not for self-preservation, but toward the epicenter of the disruption, a visceral, not a valiant reaction. It was the response of a person refusing to remain a protected bystander in the sovereign's domain. My contribution was rudimentary. I unsealed a door to the main parlor and emitted a high-pitched scream. This auditory diversion made the closest assailant pivot, affording Lorenzo the 1-second opportunity required for neutralization. It was a minor gesture, yet it was my own. Through the carnage, Lorenzo's expression was one I did not recognize. Deep astonishment, as if a foreign variable had just fractured his meticulously ordered universe. The two intruders were neutralized, as the last embers of Caruso's rebellion were extinguished. A stillness settled upon the entire apparatus. The war was done. That statement resonated in my thoughts like a slow release of pressure. I rested in the salon, back to the wall in the ambient light, contemplating the cafe, the music, the note creased in 20 seconds, and the experiential abyss between that moment and this. Lorenzo, in a rare departure from habit, sat nearby. "It is concluded," I stated. "It is," he confirmed. We remained within that quietude for a considerable period. The first semblance of normalcy arrived on a Thursday, 6 weeks on. I am certain, as a list I had posted on the refrigerator was dated as such. This appliance was in an unfamiliar kitchen within the North Side residence, a space I'd presumed would be transient, yet it lost that ephemeral feel by the 4th week. I was completing my studies through remote colloquia, granted a necessary reprieve on an assignment. My biological science manuals sat on a library shelf beside Italian literary works I explored at a measured pace. Nico resided in a modest apartment across the city, employed by a sanitation service connected to Marco. He contacted me twice a week. He was engaged in the slow, difficult labor of reprogramming conditioned reflexes, the only method for genuine change. His apologetic reflex was still present. At 21, I remained optimistic for him. Marco became a Tuesday dinner guest, invariably unaccompanied. His spouse, he explained, found the occasions draining, a feeling I understood intimately. We had formed a connection that resisted easy classification. It was less friendship than a unique solidarity between two survivors of the same crucible, viewed from the same position. He began to dispense small, unprompted vignettes from Lorenzo's youth, a tactic for acclimating a wary subject. He would bring wounded birds inside, Marco disclosed one evening. His mother would release them, yet he consistently located them once more. He fell silent. His vigil lasted for hours, not to aid their flight, but to ensure they were not solitary. I observed Marco examining his dish with focus. "I comprehend," I affirmed. The domestic employees had acclimatized to my presence as one does to a new furnishing. That imperceptible moment, an element ceases to be alien and becomes part of the environment. I was, it seemed, an anomaly to their expectations. I was neither ornament nor captive, and I projected no fear of them, a characteristic that appeared to be the greatest source of their confusion. The proposition from Lorenzo occurred at the library. He faced me on a Wednesday evening and stated, unadorned, "Your continued presence is a requirement." Our gazes met, a mutual acknowledgement that this dialogue had been postponed for 2 months. "Within these walls," I specified, demanding precision. "Within this existence," he corrected, alongside me. There was no kneeling, no jewel. The corner lamp provided its familiar illumination. The clock on the mantel measured time, and the metropolis droned below. I regarded him, remembering the man I had witnessed, forbearing, brutal, exacting, and, in moments, entirely vulnerable. I considered the psychic cost to him, the perpetual toll, my own price. "I am completing my degree," I presented as a term. "I am cognizant of that. And Nico requires a period of adaptation. I am cognizant." and facets of this reality will remain unacceptable to me. I am cognizant. You must provide absolute transparency, I stipulated, regarding the nature of this life, its strains. I don't require illicit specifics, but you must inform me when threats reemerge, when awareness is critical. His nod was authentic, not feigned. In that case, yes, I answered. This was no romantic capitulation, but a lucid, deliberate election. This is the choice I am making, yes. His hand extended across the table, covering my own, the same gesture as with his bandaged hand weeks prior. I gazed at it, sensing the deep quiet of a finalized matter, a resolution beyond contestation. The lamp maintained its watch. The clock marked the seconds. Marco, having materialized in the threshold, receded just as silently. He would later profess to have been searching for a volume. 8 months following a creased receipt and 4 words, the nuptials were a stark proceeding. The attendees included Marco, besieged by a sentiment he would perpetually disavow, Nico, seated rigidly in the first row, with the effort of one still validating his existence, and 2 of Lorenzo's retainers, whose tenure granted them unspoken judgments kept behind stoic gazes. My attire was not white, a pragmatic choice. We returned to the establishment of our origin. This was Lorenzo's design, a fact I found surprising. Voicing this, he gave a look that conveyed, "This has been considered more deeply than you can imagine," and remained silent. The ambiance of Cielo Ristorante on a Friday evening was a familiar tapestry of sound, a distant piano, and the hushed resonance of affluence. We were guided to a secluded table in the room's far left recess. Our attendant was a young man I did not know, a study in nervous proficiency, whose gaze was drawn to Lorenzo as most were. This was a phenomenon to which I had become immune. 8 months under Lorenzo's constant focus had forged its own emotional shield. Halfway through our meal, my attention registered a man across the floor. Not a danger, as my capacity for risk assessment was now exceptionally sharp. He was a civilian, dining solo with an umbrella beside his chair. His phone had fallen from the table, landing out of his sight. My focus shifted from the device to the man. He was entirely absorbed in his food, isolated in his own universe. I murmured to Lorenzo, "I will return shortly," and rose. I crossed the restaurant, retrieved the phone from the floor, and placed it on the table near the man's plate. He glanced up, his expression moving from shock to gratitude. I gave a slight nod and returned to our table. As I sat and took up my fork, I saw Lorenzo was scrutinizing me. I met his stare. What? A beat of silence passed. His expression was a layered text I still could not fully interpret, its meaning perpetually shifting. Then he uttered very quietly, "Nothing." But his hand found mine, not merely resting upon it this time. His fingers wove through my own, tightening with a permanence I had not felt before. I studied him. "You have been observing me since the day we met." "I am aware. Why?" The silence that followed was so prolonged that I considered retracting my question. In the hospital, the year after my sister's death, an old man occupied the adjacent bed. His television was perpetually on, but he gave it no attention. Every morning, the nurses would serve his breakfast. He would consume about 2/3 of the meal and set the rest aside. And every morning, when the nurse returned, he would indicate the leftover portion and say, "This is for someone who needs it more than I do." There was a brief pause. He did this every day, not to achieve an outcome, but because it was an expression of his identity. It was the one thing over which he still had dominion. My focus returned to Lorenzo. "You were a reflection of him," he said. "The note. You did not remain to witness my reaction. You did not await any kind of acknowledgement." He turned my hand over within his. "You offered something of value and simply departed, and I cannot reconcile why that." He paused, searching for the precise words. "I have existed for 3 decades in a world where every gesture is a transaction, where each gift establishes a debt, and you simply—" He shook his head faintly. "You simply disengaged." A slow Italian melody drifted from the piano. My thoughts filled with a cascade of scenes. A folded receipt on a stark counter, 2 years of ledgers, Nico's voice over the phone, a photo of a smiling girl, and Marco's tears at a small wedding, all of it converging into the pressure from this man's hand. "That is a behavioral pattern of mine," I admitted. "I know," he responded. "It continues to create a dissonance for me." The life of the restaurant hummed around our quiet space. The candles burned low. The evening progressed toward its own conclusion, unhurried as if it possessed an eternity. I gazed at the man across from me, a figure of both menace and precision, the sovereign of a delicate empire who had shown me the truth of its foundation, who had once covered my bandaged hand with his own, asking a question and awaiting a reply. I felt the gravity of my pledge and the world it encompassed, and felt no wish to evade either. I squeezed his hand, I raised my fork, we went on with our dinner,